Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan, head of Bluestack Productions, publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. And we're here today for another in our series of conversations on environmental matters. And today I'm very happy to be in Dublin meeting with Andy Pollak. Andy, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's good to have you here.
And thanks for having me at your house.
It's very good.
Andy is the director for the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, headquartered in Armagh, but with an office in Dublin as well. And for years before, Andy was a journalist with the Irish Times, covering religious affairs and educational affairs, and then in Belfast as a reporter, where I first met Andy's work years ago in the 70s, and also through his writing for Fortnight, which I've always been a big fan of. And you were the founding director of the Centre in 1999, correct? Andy, tell the audience what the Centre is and what it does.
The Centre came out of the Northern Ireland peace process, Bob, and the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. A group of us were talking around that time, from about 1996 onwards, about the possibility of the higher education sector making some contribution to the evolving peace process. At that point, I was education correspondent of the Irish Times. So a group of us came together, and over a couple of years, we looked at various ideas, and we came up with the idea of a small research centre based close to the border that would research and develop ideas for practical cross-border cooperation between North and South in the economy, in education, in health, in ICT. And that's eventually what we managed to do. With some European money, we managed to set up the centre based in Armagh in the first instance in September 99, and with the backing, although no, backing's too strong a word, we didn't get any financial support from them, but under the auspices of two universities, Dublin City University in Dublin and Queen's University in Belfast. Although we're a completely independent research centre, they sit on our board, but our board acts completely independently of the universities and gets no money from them.
Now, Andy, was there, at the same time as out of the Belfast Agreement, there was the creation of the North-South Ministerial Council. What, if any, connection was there between the cross-border studies program and the Ministerial Council?
Well, I remember very vividly 3 weeks after I started in September 99, going into the Department of Foreign Affairs and talking to a senior official called Tim O'Connor. And I remember Tim putting his arm around my shoulders and saying, "Andy, this is a good idea." And 2 months later, Tim turned up in Armagh to become the first Southern Joint Secretary of the North-South Ministerial Council. So in fact, we were 2 months in advance of the politicians and the civil servants. But we've worked very closely over the years, now 13 and a half years, with the senior civil servants who run the North-South Ministerial Council. They were once in the same building as we were in Armagh. Now they're about 100 yards down the road. And for example, our Border People Information Service, which provides practical information for people moving across the border to live, to work, to study about health and work and benefits, social benefits. That is a project we do jointly with them. And if you look on the Border People website, which provides that information, it's actually branded North-South Ministerial Council with Centre for Cross-Border Studies in the corner as the operators. So we work very closely with them. And
now the council has very limited jurisdictional and power because of the concerns partly from the unionist community about what it could do. And so your brief, though, was more open-ended, I assume, than the council's at that time.
Not only does the council oversee the 6 or 7, if you include Tourism Ireland, the 7 North-South bodies set up under the Belfast Agreement, there are also 6 areas for cooperation where the ministers come together, discuss matters of common concern, and then implement anything that is decided separately in their jurisdictions. And that covers health and education and environment and agriculture and tourism and transport. So that gives the North-South Ministerial Council a wider brief, and then it brings it more into the wide range of work that we do and includes, as I say, environment.
I think it's fair to say that environmental issues have not been a core issue, but one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you is that those of us in the environmental community are trying to figure out how do we cooperate amongst ourselves across the border, because the environmental problems, the air, the water, and as we know, illegal waste finds its way across borders. So you've had 13, 15 years of experience of this, and I just want to pick your brain and see what you've learned, what works, what doesn't work. And to start, let me just start that with, you know, there was this opposition to the cross-border cooperation by the unionist community Did you encounter that in the cross-border studies program as much?
I think a lot of unionists have realised that practical cross-border cooperation between North and South threatens nobody and can be of a benefit to anybody. And our ethos in the Centre for Cross-Border Studies is very much, we do it if there is mutual benefit to the two jurisdictions, to the people of the two jurisdictions. If it doesn't make sense to do it across the border, then we don't do it. So it has to be practical, it has to make sense to the people involved, it has to bring benefits to the people involved, and if possible, maybe some added value. And so that is why we concentrate very, very much on the practical stuff. I mean, my background is education, so education is very big. My deputy director for many years was a health expert. We did health a lot. We've done a lot of work in ICT, a lot of work in citizens information, and in more recent years, a lot of work in the economy. The environment has been something I've always wanted to do more of, and we've put our toes in the water occasionally, as you say. We did a piece of research about 8 or 9 years ago on the Agenda 21, the local sustainable development agenda, and how local authorities north and south were doing it. It was more survey north and south rather than anything that linked north and south. In more recent years, we put together a proposal with a number of local authorities on energy efficiency north and south to do it jointly with European funding. But in the end, people said, well, why are we doing this across the border? I mean, the regimes are so different, the regulations are so different, the way they do things are so different, and it all became too much. But for example, I think that's an area that would be a good area for North and South to work in, is energy efficiency. As one thing else I should add, Bob, is that one of the big success stories of the post-Belfast Agreement period since 1998 has been what they call the single electricity market, which was something that didn't come under the auspices, interestingly, of the Good Friday Agreement or the body set up or the areas for agreement set up. Energy wasn't one of them. And yet the utility companies, particularly the Electricity Supply Board in the south, saw an opportunity here to go across the border, to have a single electricity market, a single wholesale electricity market. That was a great success, very complex. I can't pretend to understand it, but the protocols were apparently enormously complex, but largely successful to the extent that now people come from all over Europe to see how cross-border energy protocols, cross-border energy provision, electricity provision can be delivered.
Yeah, it's interesting, Andy, because in some ways this suggests that the industry-driven initiative was successful because they had their self-interest, they were going to make money off this, and it operated independent of the ministerial council or the government. And is that a model we should think about in terms of environmental issues?
Increasingly, I've come to believe there is something there. I mean, I'm an old lefty, so I tend not to put business first. But I have to say that some of the more successful north-south link-ups have been business-led, and electricity is the obvious one. I think when it makes sense to provide services and provide goods on a cross-border basis, I can think of 2 or 3 others in my head now as well, particularly where companies use the border region as a hub to serve both jurisdictions, to serve both markets, north and south, bringing in imports through border ports like Warren Point to Grenore, and then serving the whole island, because the island now has much better roads than it had 15 years ago. I think there's something could be really built on there. And it's common sense, it's self-interest, it threatens nobody. And people, frankly, if they get good services and good products cheaply, and they're provided on an all-island basis, very few people will object.
Now, the interesting flip side of that coin, I think, is probably fracking, where really the industry on both sides of the border would be very keen on promoting that, but where there would be a huge pushback, as you know, from the environmental community to either regulate it much higher than it's been, or to not allow it to happen. And so there might be a real competition in a way. And then the government is caught in between the two, I assume. But even there, Andy, there's probably some value in the two governments sharing some views about fracking. Absolutely. Because it would certainly be helpful to have a common policy.
Absolutely. I think, again, and classically, where these deposits of shale oil, they're in one of the most remote, beautiful and cross-border areas of Ireland. They're between Fermanagh and Leitrim.
Yes.
If you pick 2 peripheral, poor counties in Ireland, probably northerners will plump for Fermanagh and southerners will plump for Leitrim, and they're right on the border. We're told that there are but huge potential for shale oil, and that's why the big fracking companies are looking around at it. And certainly, you're absolutely right. I don't know enough about fracking, Bob, to have come down on one side or the other. Although I suppose my gut feeling is to be suspicious of it. But if it's happening, and apparently in the United States it's a huge development, but if it's happening, it should be regulated carefully. Everybody agrees with that. Right. And why shouldn't the northern and southern regulatory authorities work together on this if the discovery of this stuff is going to be right on the border?
Because there's recently there's proposed terms of study on fracking by the Republic of Ireland, and it's being joined in by the Northern Ireland government under Alex Atwood.
Well, that's
so they're both doing a joint study over a year's time of the science and policies behind fracking. So that's probably that's an instance where it's not the industry making the cooperation, but it's at the governmental level in response to some
That's good.
concerns.
No, I mean, if Alex Atwood is environment minister, has to be said he's an SDLP environment minister, so he has no problems about doing things cross-border. Probably the right man in the right place, and then his equivalent in the south. That sounds like makes sense to me.
Now, are there other lessons that you've learned over the years at the center where there might be ways for the two organizations and environmental communities in North and South to cooperate either with or opposed to government policies through the universities? Or
well, again, you have very good dynamic environmentalists in universities like John Barry in Queen's. Yes. John happens to be a southerner. John did an article for one of our journals a few years ago when he suggested certain areas where people could work together. I think he mentioned, for example, the transition towns movement, which is a northern-southern thing, which exists in the north and the south. And that would be an obvious grassroots movement that could link up. One of the problems, Bob, is that civil society is actually quite behind in linking up north and south. The community and voluntary sector, other civil society bodies have not been as advanced in linking up with their equivalents on the other side of the border as, for example, business organizations have, as people in education have, as people in health have. Right. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I think it's partly it's two things, I think, probably. One, it's because until 2008, the community and voluntary sectors, as we call it in here, I don't know what you call it in the States, have been very well funded by their respective jurisdictions, and therefore they didn't need to look to cross-border cooperation. Cross-border cooperation was a kind of added luxury, a nice little extra. And then, of course, in 2008, when that whole thing collapsed and the funding started to be cut much more in the south than in the north, the northern community and voluntary sector is still pretty well funded. The southern sector has been hit very hard by spending cuts. It was kind of too late then. The money wasn't there anymore. So that's the first thing. The first thing, they were very well funded, and they saw no reason to link up with people in the other jurisdiction. The second thing is, I think there was a lack of leadership. I really think that when I look at why business worked so well together and education to a certain extent worked well together, particularly, and health worked very well together, particularly health, is because there were individuals who championed cross-border cooperation, who said, it makes sense to do this bit of what we do, say, in health, in the border region. There's a very good cross-border network of health authorities in the border region. That started in 1992 when some far-sighted people said, we're very peripheral. Belfast and Dublin doesn't think much about us. Should we maybe work together across the border in certain niche areas? It was very complex, very difficult, but they got round it in the last 20 years, and they're a kind of a model. There wasn't that kind of leadership. And I suppose the civil society, community and voluntary sector is by definition more fractured, more splintered. But I definitely I get the impression, I did a little bit of research on this last year, that I was very struck how senior people in the community and voluntary sector really didn't know how the other jurisdiction worked. Whereas when you talk to business and you talk to health people, they actually have come to know how the other jurisdiction works. It was a striking difference.
You talked about the funding. If there was a cross-border funding for the environmental groups, it might be a way of getting them to
you see, for the past 15 years, there's been very generous funding from Europe. By one estimation, over 2.5 billion euros has been put into cross-community and cross-border projects by the European Union's various funds, what they call the Peace and the Interreg funds. Now, to my knowledge, environmental groups have access that to a certain extent, but not in a dramatic way.
Mm-hmm.
When I look through the projects funded, every so often I'll come across a very good environmental project. I came across a very good biodiversity project recently that's currently being funded under Interreg. But not in a major way, and you don't see. I mean, you would have thought that would be an obvious area, given that it's one of the 3 pillars of European cooperation, environmental. But again, I think maybe a lack of leadership, that nobody saw the opportunity in, for example, the way that business was very smart, the way they accessed European money, and health as well. The money that's been there for the last 15 years for cross-border cooperation has not been Irish government money, has not at all been Northern Ireland government money, zero money from London. The vast bulk of it has been European money. And so the smart operators said, that's where we'll apply for. And I can only guess, because there have been, to my knowledge, no major cross-border environmental projects. I'm sure there are lots of small ones, because the EU was particularly, in its early phases of funding, it funded a lot of grassroots projects, many of which were environmental. But then as the money got less, and the policymakers decided to concentrate more on government, local authorities, business, and away from the community and voluntary sector, which started to happen in the early 2000s. I think probably you'd find that the numbers of environmental projects probably went down.
Yeah. What's in the future for Andy Pollak? Because you're leaving the centre.
I'm retiring in July.
In July.
I'm going to write a book about the contribution of North-South cooperation to the Irish peace process, and I'm going to make it future-oriented. I'm going to look to the future of Ireland based on cross-border cooperation, because I believe, Bob, that it's the slow, painstaking business of learning how to work and live together that's going to remove the poison of centuries of suspicion, of misunderstanding, of fear and violence on this island. That's going to be the thesis of my book, that we learn to work together on areas of mutual interest and mutual benefit, and through that, over a period of time, we learn to become neighbours, and eventually become friends, and eventually, who knows? But we'll learn how to share the island together.
And when are we going to get that on the bookstores?
Oh, I don't know. I'll start that when I finish here. When I finish this job in July, I'll start it in the autumn. And it's, I will do it, but it won't be easy. But I'm going to do it.
Keep your eyes out for the book, please, okay? Andy, thanks for talking with us.
All right, Bob.